Part 3 of The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Pinner, told from the view of Nella and Eliza. As I opened the door for the woman whose arrival I've been dreading, shadows threw her figure into a silhouette, and her features were masked behind a sheer veil. I can make out only the width of her skirts and the delicate lace trimming around her collar. Then she took a hesitant step forward into the shop, and a breeze of lavender floated behind her, and the candlelight illuminated her form. I covered a gasp for the second time this week. Before me stood a customer unlike any that had been in my shop. First it had been a child, but now it was a grown woman who, by mere appearances, seemed more suited to the airy parlors of Kensington than my lowly, concealed shop. Her gown, a deep green, edged with golden embroidered lilies, seized nearly a quarter of the space, and I feared a single turn may send all my vials to the floor. The woman removed her veil and gloves, setting them down on the table. Eliza seemed unsurprised by the visitor, taking the gloves immediately to the fire to dry them. The gesture was so obvious, and yet one that had not crossed my mind as I stood, stunned, observing the lady poised before me. If there was any doubt about her wealth, her status, it was gone now. "It's so dark in here," she said, her painted lips turned downwards. "I will add more wood to the fire," chirped Eliza. It was only her second time in my shop, and yet in some way she had begun to outwit me. "Sit, my lady, please," I said, motioning to the second chair. She lowered herself into the chair and let out a long, shaky breath. She removed a small hairpin from the back of her head, adjusted a dangle of curls, and repinned them into place. Eliza stepped forward with a mug in her hand, settling it carefully on the table before the woman. "Warm peppermint water, miss?" she said, curtsying. I looked at Eliza perplexed, wondering where she had found the spare mug, much less the crushed peppermint leaves. There was no chair for her, but I expected her to drop onto the floor or busy herself with the magic book I had given her. "Thank you for the information in the letter," I said to the woman. She raised her brow. I didn't know how much to say. I took great lengths to protect myself. In an event it was seized. Yet another reason I didn't meddle in the rich. People always wanted what they have, their secrets most of all. You said just enough, and I believe you will be pleased with the preparations. A loud screeching sound interrupted us, and I turned to see Eliza dragging a wooden box across the floor. She pushed the box up to the table, between the woman and myself, and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm Eliza," she said to the woman. "We are so pleased to have you here." "Thank you," the woman replied, her eyes softening as she looked at the girl. "When I made my way over here today, I did not realize there would be two of you." She looked at me. "Is this your daughter?" Oh, how I wish my daughter were here beside me. But then we would not have been doing all this, dispensing poisons and hiding in shadows. I choked over my response. "She helps me on occasion," I lied, unwilling to admit that Eliza had arrived without notice at the perfectly wrong time. There were only 2 chairs at the table for a reason, and I soon felt a cloud of regret in permitting Eliza to stay. I had spent a lifetime valuing discretion, and I saw clearly now the mistake in allowing her to intrude on the secrets exchanged between this woman and myself. "Eliza, perhaps you should take leave of us now." "No," the woman said, with the force of someone well accustomed to getting her way. "This peppermint tea is very good," she continued, "and soon I'd like more. Besides, I find the presence of a child to be comforting. I don't have children of my own, you know, as badly as I want them, and as much as we've—" She paused. "Oh, never mind that. How old are you, little Eliza, and where are you from?" I could hardly believe it. This woman, surely an heiress to some great estate, shared something in common with me. We both desired the swelling of our bellies, the little kicks in our womb, and yet how lucky she was that her time, not yet past. The skin around her eyes told me she could not be more than 30 years old. It was not too late for her. 12, Eliza said softly, and I'm from Swindon. The woman nodded approvingly, and I, desperate to conclude the appointment, walked to one of my shelves and withdrew a small sheep horn jar. I motioned to Eliza to help me, then I directed her to carefully spoon the beetle powder from the bowl on the table into the jar. As I had hoped, her hand was steadier than mine. Once we finished, I set the uncovered jar before the woman for her to inspect. Inside, a luscious green powder shimmered back at her, so fine it could run between her fingers like water. "Cantharides," I whispered. Her eyes widened. "Is it safe to be this close?" she asked. She scooted forward in her chair. Her enormous skirts rustled around her legs. "Yes, so long as you don't touch it." Eliza leaned forward to peek into the jar, while the woman nodded, her brows still lifted in surprise. "I have heard of it only once. Something about its use in the Parisian brothels." She tilted the bowl slightly towards her. "How long does this take?" The memory of crossing the river Thames, my coughing fit, the woman feeding her baby, Beatrice, seized me at once. "All night into this morning," I breathed. "It requires more than just harvesting the beetles. They must be roasted over the fire and ground." I pointed to the mortar bowl and pestle across the small room. The bowl was as wide across as the woman's bodice. "I grind them up in that basin over there." The lady's name, who I still did not know, lifted the jar of powder and shifted it in the light. "Do I simply drop the powder into a bit of food or drink? Is it really that simple?" I crossed my ankles and leaned back in the chair. "You asked for something to incite lust. Cantharides are meant foremost to arouse. Blood will rush into the loins and take over." I paused, aware that Eliza continued to listen closely. I turned to her. "This is not for young ears. Might you consider stepping out into the storage room?" But the woman placed a hand over mine and shook her head. "It is my powder, is it not? Go on, let the girl learn." I sighed. I continued. "The swelling of the groin is insatiable. This arousal will continue for some time, then will be accompanied by abdominal pain and mouth blisters. I suggest you brew something dark, a molasses liqueur perhaps, and drop in the powder, then give it a good stir." I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "A quarter of the jar, and he will not survive the night. Half of it, and he will not survive the hour." There was a long pause as the lady considered this, and the only noise came from the clock ticking on the door and the snapping of the fire. I remained still, my previous unease of the woman's visit returning with vengeance. She mindlessly touched the thin wedding band adoring her finger, her gaze locked on the low flame behind me, fire dancing in her eyes. She lifted her chin. "I cannot kill him. I cannot have a child if I kill him." At once I feared I had not properly explained the danger of the powder. My voice began to shake. "I assure you, this is a deadly poison. You cannot safely administer a non-fatal amount." She raised her hand to stop me. "You misunderstood me. I do indeed seek a deadly poison. I only mean to say it is not for him I want to kill. It is her." Her. I flinched at this final word. There was nothing more I needed to know. It was not the first request of this kind over the preceding 2 decades. I had been asked several times to dispense of a poison that would be administered to another woman, but I had refused these customers without question. No matter the underlying betrayal, no woman would suffer at my hands. My mother founded the Apothecary shop at 3 Back Alley to heal and nurture women, and I would preserve this until the day I die. It was possible, of course, that some of the customers told me lies, that they kept their true intentions from me and meant to slip my tinctures to sisters or courtesans. And how could I stop them? It would have been impossible, but as far as I knew, my poisons have never been used against a woman. Never, and so long as I live, I would not knowingly agree to it. I considered how I might say this now, how I might tell this woman no, but her eyes were dark, and I felt sure she sensed my desire to refuse her. She seized the moment of silence, my weakness, like I was a rabbit and she a fox. She squared her shoulders towards me. You do not seem pleased by this. I had resigned some of my senses, and words no longer resisted. I appreciate your efforts in seeking me out, but I cannot agree to this. I cannot send you away with this powder if you mean to kill a woman. This shop is meant to help and heal women, not harm them. That remains the cornerstone. I won't dislodge it. And yet you're a murderer, she accused. How can you talk about helping and healing anything, man or woman? She glanced at the open jar of beetle powder. Do you even care to know who she is? This incest? She is the mistress, this whore. The woman continued to explain, but her words deteriorated into a faint hum as I blinked slowly, the room going dark around me. An old, shameful memory closed in. I had been a mistress once, too, though I had not known it at the time. An incest, a whore, according to this woman. I was the secret kept in the shadows, not someone to be loved, but a form of amusement. And no matter how I adored him, I would never forget the moment that I learned of Frederick's masquerade, of his web of lies. It was a bitter thing to swallow, the realization that I had been little more than an empty vessel for Frederick's lust. If only this had been the worst of his tragedies, the worst of what had been done to me. Instinctively, I grazed my fingers over my belly. This merciless woman was not worth another moment of my time. I would not tell her about my story, about the coward who sowed the first seed of the tainted legacy that brought her to my door. As the room continued to whirl about me, her chatter finally ceased. My unsteady hand sought the flat, hard safety of the table. Unsure of how many seconds or minutes went by, I eventually became aware of Eliza shaking me by the shoulders. "Nella," she whispered, "Nella, are you well?" My vision cleared, and I saw the two of them sitting across from me with troubled looks in their eyes. Eliza, leaning forward to touch me, appeared concerned for my well-being. The woman, however, resembled a petulant child, fearful that she might not be given what she wanted. Comforted by Eliza's touch, I forced a small nod, shaking loose the memories. "I am well, yes," I assured her. Then I turned to the lady. "It is my business only who I choose to help and who I choose to hurt. I will not sell this powder." She looked at me with disbelief, her eyes narrow, as though it was the first time that she had been told no. She let out a single barking laugh. "I am Lady Clarence of Carter Lane. My husband—" She paused, looking at the jar of beetle powder. "My husband is Lord Clarence." She watched me closely, waiting for my surprised reaction, but I gave her no such satisfaction. "You cannot understand the urgency for this clearly," she continued. "As I said in my letter, we are to have a party tomorrow eve. Miss Beckwell, my husband's cousin, and mistress will attend." Lady Clarence tugged at the hem of her bodice, rubbing her lips together. "She's in love with my husband, and he with her. It cannot continue. Month after month I assure you that I am not with child, because he has nothing left for me, having spent it all in her. I will take this powder," she said, reaching into a pocket sewn into her skirts near her waist. "How much do you want, anyhow? I'll give you twice of what you're asking for it." I shook my head, caring little for her money. I would not have it, just like I would not have another woman harmed, mistress or not. Not on my account. No, I said, standing from my chair and rooting my feet to the ground. The answer is no. You may leave now. Lady Clarence stood from her own chair, our eyes level. Meanwhile, Eliza's head jerked back and forth as she looked at us on either side of her. She sat straight up, back rigid, lips pressed tightly. When she asked to be my apprentice, I doubt she imagined an encounter like this one. Perhaps it would be enough to make her change her mind. At once there was a flurry of movement. I thought that Lady Clarence had dropped her money onto the table, for her hands darted around quickly, but then I realized with horror that one of her hands was reaching for the jar of powder, which Eliza and I had not yet corked, at the center of the table, and her other hand stretched open her pocket. She intended to take the luscious green powder, no matter my wishes. I'd lunged for the jar, snatching it from her fingers at the last moment, and bumping into Eliza with such force that she nearly fell off her box, and did the only thing that came to mind. I tossed the jar of poisonous cantharids into the fire, and the flames grew bright behind me. The flames exploded into a bright green flare, in an instant rendering the poison worthless. I stared at the fireplace in astonishment, hardly able to believe that a night and morning's work had just been so easily destroyed. My hands shaking, I turned very slowly to see Lady Clarence, flushed and astonished, and the little Eliza's eyes wide as eggs staring back at me. "I cannot," Lady Clarence stuttered. "I cannot." Her eyes darted around the room like mice, searching for a second jar. "Have you gone mad? The party is tomorrow evening." "There is no more," I told her, before motioning to the door. Lady Clarence glared at me, then turned to Eliza. "My gloves," she demanded. Eliza sprang into action, delicately lifting the gloves from the drying rack, and handed them to Lady Clarence. She began to pull the gloves on, shoving her fingers deep into them, one at a time. After several heavy breaths, she spoke again. "You can easily make me another batch, I'm sure," she said. God, this woman was insufferable. I threw my hands up in dismay. "Is there not one physician that you can bribe? Why must you put this on me, after I've refused you twice?" She draped her veil over her face, the delicate strands of lace reminding me of hemlock leaves. "You fool," she retorted from behind her lace. "Don't you think I've considered every physician, every known apothecary in the city? I don't want to be caught. Do you not even know your own distinction?" She paused, straightening her gown. "It's been a mistake to place my trust in you, but there's little use in reversing my decision now." She glanced down at her gloved hands, counting off a few fingers. "You made the powder in only a day, right?" I furrowed my brow in confusion. What did it matter at this point? "Yes," I muttered. "Very good," Lady Clarence said. "I will return tomorrow, as I understand that it is an ample time to prepare the powder anew, and you will give me a bowl of fresh cantharids, identical in appearance and form to those which you foolishly ruined. I will be here at 1:30. I stared at her, dumbfounded, ready to push her out the door with Eliza's help, if I must. "If you do not have the powder ready for me as I've asked," Lady Clarence continued, "then you better gather your things and make haste, for I will go straight to the authorities and tell them all about your little shop full of cobwebs and rat poison. And when I speak to them, I'll make special note to proceed through the storage room and check behind the wall at the back. Every secret within this squalid hole will come to light." She pulled her shawl tightly around her. "I'm the wife of a lord. Don't try any tricks on me." She yanked the door open and let herself out, slamming it shut behind her. Eliza, February 8th, 1791. After Lady Clarence rushed out of Nella's shop, the air in the small room felt humid and hot, like it did in the kitchen. The hair on my arm stood on end. I'd never heard anyone speak in the tones Nella and Lady Clarence had, exchanged a moment ago. Nella's face twisted into the look of misery and fatigue. I could see how the weight of her work and the demands of women like Lady Clarence had carved lines onto her forehead and sunk pockets into her cheeks. Faint wisps of smoke still curled in the air, and she slumped to the side in her chair. Concern splashed all over her face like spilled vinegar. "Kill the mistress of a lord," she mumbled, "or swing from the gallows." She rolled her head to look into the fire, as though searching for what remained of her beetles. "Each choice is more hideous than the other. You must remake the powder." She did not ask for my opinion, but the words came out of me before I knew what I was saying. "It is the only option." She turned on me, her eyes crazed. "Easier than killing a woman? All my life I have sought to help women. Indeed, it is the only part of my mother's legacy that I have maintained with a measure of success. But Nella has shown me her register, and I knew the entries consisted of names and dates and remedies. Worse than this, I know that Mr. Amwell's name and my own were listed within. Which meant that if Nella did not remake the powder, and Lady Clarence sought revenge, I would be exposed. All of us in the book, exposed. I pointed my finger at her book. "You may find a way to avoid writing Miss Birkwell's name in there. But what about me? What about the others written in those pages?" Nella looked down at the book and frowned, like she had not even considered this idea, like she did not really believe that Lady Clarence would make good on her threat. She slowly read a few rows. "I haven't the strength," she whispered at last. "I spent all last night in the fields gathering the beetles until sunrise. I toasted and ground them. When she comes back tomorrow, I'll tell her such. I'll show her the swelling underneath my gown, the places I am unwell, if she insists on seeing them. I could not remake the powder, even if I wished to do so." An opportunity now stood before me. If I could be smart about it. My fears about Mr. Amwell's spirit had not lessened, and now I was burdened with yet another misfortune, the bailiffs uncovering Nella's shop and register. I retrieved the empty mugs on the table and took them to the wash basin, rinsing them out. "I will do it, then. I will gather the beetles, if you tell me how. I will roast them and grind them." After all, I was well accustomed to doing other persons' dishonorable work, whether it meant writing lies and letters for Mrs. Amwell, or crushing poisonous beetles for Nella. I was no tattle. I could be trusted. Nella did not answer for some time, so I continued to rinse the mugs long after they were clean. Her nerves seemed to have quieted for the moment, though I could not tell if it was because she felt hopeful to my offer to assist her, or because she was resigned to her fate. "The field is across the river," she said at last, leaning forward in her chair, as though exhausted by the mere idea of returning. "It will be a long walk, but you cannot do it alone. I'll gather the strength. We'll go after the sun falls. The beetles are easier to catch at night, when they rest." She coughed several times and wiped her hand on her skirts. "Until then, we may as well make use of our time. Earlier you mentioned helping me with the labels on my vials." She gave me a sidelong glance. "It's not needed. I know them by heart, with a label or no." "What if they get mixed up, or put out of order?" She pointed first at her nose, then her eyes. Scent, then sight. She motioned to the register at the center of the table. "But there's something else. I'll have you fix a few of the faded entries in my book. I've not the steadiness of hand to do it myself." I frowned, pulling on the broad book towards me, wondering how the names and the dates in the register could possibly be more important than the vials on her shelves. In fact, I expected the opposite. This book held names of everyone who had purchased Nella's poison. It seems to me the pages should be burned, not repaired. "Why is it so important to fix the faded entries?" I asked. Nella leaned forward and turned to a page riddled with entries from 1763. She ran her hand over the bottom left corner. At one time, A liquid had doused the parchment, leaving many of the entries unreadable. She pushed the quill and inkwell towards me. At her direction, I lifted the pen and began to copy the faint strokes into the books with fresh ink, tracing the remedies, sorrel, balsam, safflower, as carefully as I traced the names of the customers. For many of these women, Nella whispered, this may be the only place their names are recorded, the only place they will be remembered. It is a promise I made to my mother to preserve the existence of these women whose names would otherwise be erased from history. The world is not kind to us. There are few places for a woman to leave an inkable mark. I finished tracing an entry, moving on to the next one. But this register preserves them, their names, their memories, their worth. It was a hard task that I imagine, this tracing and darkening. Copying words was not the same as writing words. It required me to move very slowly, with the curves of someone else's hand, and I did not feel as proud of my work as I hoped. Yet Nella did not seem to mind, and I let my shoulders relax, which made my task go quicker. Nella turned to a more recent page of entries just made a few months ago. At some point the pages must have stuck together, damaging several lines of text. I began to trace the first one, reading as I went. December 7, 1790. Mr. Beckham, Black Hill born, 12 grams, on behalf of his sister, Ms. Allie Beckham. I gasped, pointing at the word sister. I remember that one, Nella said as I darkened the letters. Miss Beckham's brother was a greedy man. She discovered a letter. He meant to kill their father in a week's time, to inherit a great estate. She killed her brother so he would not kill their father? Precisely. You understand, Eliza, that no good comes of greed. Certainly no good came of this. Miss Beckham felt someone would end up dead. The question then was who? I traced Miss Beckham's first name, Allie, making long downward strokes. The quill moved easily over the rough parchment, as though the pen itself knew the importance of this effort, the importance of preserving Miss Allie Beckham's name and what she'd done. Then my eyes caught her name again. Just several days later, on December 11th, she'd returned to the shop. This time I sold Miss Beckham's nerve root for her mother, Nella explained. The poor woman had just lost her son, and quite unexpectedly at that. Nerve root is entirely benign, not harmful in any way. It was meant for hysteria. Poor lady, I do hope it worked. Nella motioned to the register, urging me to finish the page. Nerve root is quite effective, she said, though the truth about her son and his plot would have been the best remedy. Alas, I don't know if her daughter revealed it. No matter, her secret is safe here. She ran her finger along the edge of the book, toying with the pages. I understand now why Nella sold medicines in addition to her poisons. People like Miss Beckham needed both, except I still did not know why Nella sold poisons at all. During my first visit to her shop, she said the hidden room didn't exist when she worked at the shop as a child with her mother. Why did Nella build the secret room and begin to brew terrible things behind it? I resolved to find the courage to ask her, and soon. After I finished the entry, Nella flipped through the pages again, landing on 1789. The year stood out in memory. It was the year my mother had left me in London to work for the Amwell family. Only the entries on this page appeared in good condition. I could not see any that needed work. Why, this is just before I arrived in London, I offered. I think you might like this page, Nella replied. There is a name on here you might recognize. At once it became a game. I scanned my eyes over the entries, doing my best to ignore the dates and the ingredients, searching instead for a name I knew. My own mother, perhaps? Then I saw it. Mrs. Amwell. Oh, I gasped. My mistress. Quickly I read the rest of the entry. Had my mistress poisoned someone once before? Indian hemp? I asked Nella, pointing to the register. One of the most powerful drugs in my shop, she said, but like the nerve root, there is nothing harmful about it. Indian hemp is especially useful in the case of tremors or spasms. She looked at me, waiting. When I did not respond, she explained. Eliza, your mistress came to my shop when the shaking in her hands first began. I'd forgotten about her visit until you mentioned earlier today that you write her letters for her. She ran her finger over the entry, a faraway look in her eyes. The gentleman's doctor could not do nothing for her. She paid visits to dozens of them. She came to me when she first had no options left. She briefly set her hands over mine. Your mistress had never been here before. She only knew of it from a friend. A sense of overwhelming sadness fell over me. I'd never considered that Mrs. Amwa had sought out so many doctors. I'd never considered at all how she felt about her impediment. Did the Indian hemp help? I asked, glancing again at the entry to ensure I repeated the words correctly. Nella paused and looked down at her own hands, as if ashamed. Remember what I told you, Eliza, she finally said. This is not a shop of magic. The gifts of the earth, while valuable, are not infallible. She lifted her head, shaking herself from her reverie. But it's all right, for if the Indian hemp had worked too well, then your mistress would not need you to help writing her letters, and you would not be sitting here now, helping me with my register. And you remember what I said about the importance of the register, right? Aiming to impress her, I recited what she had told me a few minutes ago. The register is important because the names of these women might otherwise be forgotten. They are preserved here in your pages, if nowhere else. Very good, Nella concluded. Now let's do a few more. The sun is falling fast. How did she know, without windows, or without glancing at the clock? I certainly could not tell if the sun was falling fast. But I could not ask her, for Nell had already turned to another page, hovering her hand over an entry that needed attention. I got back to work, eager to please my new tutor. After sundown, I gathered my coat and pulled out my gloves, which had never shifted through shrubs or dirt or wherever that beetles made their home, and eagerly pulled them on. My hands were sore already. The careful tracing had left them stiff, but I could not hardly wait for the next adventure. Seeing the spark in my eye, Nella raised her brow. Don't expect your gloves to be so clean when you're done, she said. This is dirty work, child. We walked for more than an hour, eventually making our way to a broad, quiet field separated from the road by hedges that were taller than me. The air grew unbearably cold as darkness spread across the night. I could not help but think that if I were a beetle, I would have traveled south long ago to the warm, humid air of some seaside village. And yet Nella assured me that the beetles liked the cold, that they preferred the starchy root crops like beets, where they could nestle in and dine on sugar and then sleep. There was only a sliver of moon to see by. Nella and I each held a linen sack. I watched her closely in the dark as she got onto her hands and knees, located a bundle of green, viney leaves, and brushed aside the thin layer of hay until she reached the shoulders of the beet bulb underneath. Here we have the fruit, she said, continuing to dig. They prefer to eat the leaves, but this time of night they will be burrowed deep into the soil. And then out of nowhere she withdrew a glossy little bug no larger than her thumbnail. Now this is very important, she said, dropping the squirmy beetle into the bag. Do not press them or crush them. I wiggled my toes in my shoes, hardly able to feel them even though we had been in the field for only a few minutes. How can I get one from the ground without pressing it? I asked, my interest in the whole activity suddenly waning. When I find one, I will need to grab him before he runs off, and I cannot do that without pressing on him a bit. Let's do the next one together, she urged, patting the ground beside her. It seemed her aches and discomfort had lessened. Perhaps the cold had numbed her. Reached into the same spot where I had just put my hand. I'm sure I felt another set of legs. I shuddered. I had expected we would use tools a net or a spade. Instead, our gloved hands. But I did not ask, grateful for the dark had prevented her from seeing the grimace on my face. I moved my hand around the hard, smooth bulb of beetroot, and then I felt it, something crawling against my fingers, something very much alive. Stealing it myself, I twisted my hand into the dirt and cupped a finger around it. I lifted a pile of soil to show Nella, and sure enough, a green striped beetle crawled out of the dirt as though to greet us. "Very good," she said. "Your first harvest. Drop him in the bag and close it up, else he will make a quick work of escaping back to his little beetroot. I'll start over here, on the next row. We need 100 beetles. Keep count of yours." 100? I glanced down at my single beetle, withering around in the bag. "Why, we'll be here all night." She cocked her head at me, her face serious. The moonlight reflected against her left eye, giving her a strange, two-faced appearance. "It's curious to me, child, that you've complained of the efforts in catching a night's worth of beetles, mere bugs, and yet you think nothing of killing a man." I shuddered, wishing she hadn't reminded me of Mr. Amwell's ghost, still pressing inside of me, making me trickle blood. "It is hard work," she said, "the harder for me as of late. Go on now, let's get it done." The night passed, though how much of it I could not in truth be sure. The moon moved a quarter of the way across the sky, but I was not wise enough to use it as my clock. 74, I heard Nella say from behind me, her feet crunching on the hay beneath us. "And you?" 28, I replied. I counted diligently, repeating the number in my head, lest I forget and be forced to reach in and count the crunchy bugs again. Aye, we're almost finished then, with 2 or 3 to spare. She helped me to my feet. My knees were sore and my hands raw. We began to walk towards the road when I grabbed her arm, distress warming me in an instant. "There will be no coaches running this late," I gasped. "We do not have to walk all the way back, do we?" "I could not do it, not for anything." "You have 2 perfectly good legs, don't you?" she replied. But at the sight of my miserable expression, she broke into a smile. "Oh, don't despair. We will rest over there in that shed. It's quite warm, in fact, and perfectly quiet. We will take the first coach in the morning." Trespassing seemed a worse offense than harvesting deadly beetles, but I followed Nella willingly, excitedly even, for I desperately wanted to rest. As we went through an unlocked door and into the wooden shed that was, as she promised, warm, quiet, and dark, it reminded me of the barn at home in the country, and I cringed at the thought of what my mother would say to me if she saw me now, awake in the middle of the night with a bag of deadly beetles in my hand. It took my eyes several moments to adjust, but eventually I could make out a wheelbarrow at the far end of the structure, and, closer to us, an assortment of tools for tending a field. Along the wall to our right, several haystacks were pushed neatly up against one another. It was here that Nella stepped forward, nestling herself against one of the stacks. "It's warmest here," she urged. "If you pile up a bit of hay on the ground, it makes a decent bed. Watch out for mice, though. They like it here as much as we do." Looking back at the door, fearing that some angry grounds owner might come chasing after us, I reluctantly followed Nella and made my own spot. She sat across from me, our feet almost touching, then pulled a small bundle from underneath her coat and unwrapped a loaf of bread, a bit of cheese, and a leather canteen of what I assumed was water. The moment she handed it to me, I realized how desperately thirsty I was. As I drank, the beetles in the bag rustled next to me. "Have as much as you want," she said. "There's a barrel behind this shed full of rainwater." I realized that not only had she used the shed previously for shelter, but she had apparently explored the grounds for other resources. I finally pulled the canteen away and wiped the water from my lips with the long edge of my skirt. "Do you often go onto other people's farmland to get what you need?" I thought not only of this shed, which did not belong to us, but the field where we just spent an entire night. She shook her head. Almost never. The wild, uncultivated earth provides most of what I need, and she disguises well her poisons. You have seen a belladonna bloom, yes? It opens like a cocoon. It seduces almost. It seems rare and unusual, but the truth is that this sort of thing may be found anywhere. The earth knows the secrets to disguise, and many would not believe that the low fields they tend, or the trestle vines under which they kiss, hold poisons within their stems. Only one needs to know where to look. I glanced at the hay bales against where we sat, wondering if Nella had some trick, possibly, to extract poison from something as innocent as dried grass. Did you learn all this from books? In her shop I had seen stacks of dozens of books, some appearing worn and well used, and I began to feel foolish for broaching the idea of a short apprenticeship. It must have taken years to learn everything she knew. Nella took a bit of cheese, chewing slowly. No, my mother. Her words were sharp and uninviting, but this only piqued to serve my curiosity. Your mother, who did not have the wall or the poisons. That's right. As I've said, a woman does not need to hide behind a wall if she has no secrets and does no wrong. I thought about my mistress and myself sitting in the drawing room behind a closed door, pretending to write letters while Mr. Amwell suffered upstairs. My mother was a good woman, Nella added, letting out a shaky breath. She did not dispose a single poison in her lifetime. You may have noticed it while looking through certain entries in my book. The older remedies are helpful, all of them. I sat up straighter, wondering if Nella might finally share her story with me. Bravely, I ventured the question. If she did not dispose poisons, how did she teach you about them? Nella looked hard at me. Many good remedies are poisonous in great quantities, or when prepared in a certain way. She taught me quantities and preparations for my own safety, and for safety of our patrons. Besides, just because my mother did not use poisons against anyone, does not mean that she did not know how. She nestled further into the hay bale. I suppose this makes her even more admirable, like a dog with a mouthful of sharp teeth, who never once attacked. My mother's knowledge was a weapon, but she never used it. But you... The words tumbled out of me, and I snapped my mouth shut before I finished. It was clear that Nella had decided to use her own knowledge as a weapon. Why? Yes, me. She folded her hands in her lap and met my gaze directly. Eliza, let me ask you something. When you set the plate in front of Mr. Amwell, the one with the larger eggs, which you knew would kill him that very day, what did you feel inside? I thought carefully, remembering the moment as though it happened only moments ago. His hot gaze as I stepped into the dining room, my mistress's soft eyes in a quiet alliance with me, and the sensation of oily fingers trailing up the back of my knee and along the skin of my thigh. I thought, too, of the day Mr. Amwell, my once trusted master, gave me the brandy while my mistress was at the winter gardens, and what might have happened if the footman had not called him to come downstairs. I felt like I was protecting myself, I said, because he meant to do me harm. Nella nodded eagerly, as she might if she was leading me down a path in the forest, encouraging me to follow. And what were you protecting yourself from? I swallowed, nervous to share the truth. I had never told Nella why Mrs. Amwell wanted to kill her husband, and why I wanted to help her do it. But I was the first one to ask the prying question, so I owed her my story too. He had begun to touch me in ways that I did not like. Again, a slow nod. Yes, but look deeper than that. His unwelcome touch, as much as it repulsed you, why is it different than, say, a stranger on the street? I suspect you would not resort to murder if a stranger let his hand stray. I do not trust most strangers on the street, I said, but I trusted Mr. Amwell. Until recently, he gave me no reason to. I paused, slowing my breath, and thought of Johanna. I learned there are secrets in his house, things he destroyed, things he had kept hidden. I feared I was to be one of them. Satisfied, Nella leaned forward and patted her foot. First there was trust, then there was betrayal. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot be betrayed by someone you do not trust. I nodded. She leaned back again. Eliza, what you have just described is the same heart-wrenching journey of every woman to whom I have sold a poison, and it is indeed the same path for me. She frowned, as if thinking of a long-buried memory. I did not set out to brew poison. It is not as though I came from the womb a born killer. Something happened to me a long time ago. I was in love once, you see. His name was Frederick. She stopped suddenly, in spite of herself, and I thought she might cease her story, but she cleared her throat and went on. I expected a proposal. He had promised it to me. Alas, he was a fantastic actor and liar, and I soon learned I was not the only recipient of his affection. I gasped and placed my hand over my mouth. How did you find out? I asked, feeling privy to the scandal and secrets typically reserved for girls much older than myself. It's a sad story, Eliza, she said. She nudged my foot with her own, and you must listen very carefully to me. After we prepare the beetle powder together in the morning, I do not want to see you at my shop again. This is my work, my grief to bottle up and dispense. Disappointment and enthrallment tugged equally at me, but I nodded so she would go on. And so she began her story, as though each word seemed to rise painfully to the surface like a boil. I also sensed that her words were a form of release. I might have been only 12, but sitting together amidst the hay bales, I felt as if Nella considered me a friend. My mother died when I was a young woman, she explained. This was 2 decades ago, though the grief is still tender, like a bruise. Have you ever grieved? I shook my head. Other than Mr. Amwell, I've never known someone who died. Nella took a deep, steady breath. It is a terrible, exhausting, lonely thing. One day, at the very peak of my grief, a young man named Frederick arrived at the shop, which was one not of poisons yet, and he begged for something to give his sister, Rissa, to induce bleeding, for the cramping in her belly was unbearable, and it had been half a year since her monthly course. I frowned. I was not sure what monthly course meant, but no matter how Rissa played into the story, I could empathize with her belly pains. He was the first man to step foot into my shop, Nella continued, but he was so desperate. And if Rissa did not have a sister or a mother to send, how could I refuse him? So I gave him a tincture of motherwort and menagog. Motherwort, I repeated. Is that for mothers? Nella smiled and went on to explain that a century ago, Culpeper, the great healer, believed it to bring joy to a new mother and remove the melancholy so common in the days after childbirth. But you see, she continued, motherwort also settles the womb and stimulates the belly to shed what's inside. In doing so, it must be administered very carefully, and only to those who are positive they do not want to have a child. She pulled a stem of hay from the bale and began to twist it around her finger like a ring. The next week, Frederick returned, vibrant and gentlemanlike, thanking me for returning his sister to her normal, healthy self. I found myself intensely drawn to him for reasons I didn't understand at the time. I thought it love then, but now I wonder if it wasn't simply the emptiness of grief, seeking something to rush into and take away the barren feeling. She exhaled. Frederick seemed drawn to me too, and in the weeks that followed he promised his hand. With each passing day, each promise, something in my heart came back to life. He promised me a house full of children and a beautiful shop with pink glass windows to carry the memory of my mother. Imagine how that made me feel. What would I call it other than love? She looked down at her hand, where the stem of the hay was wrapped in a perfect circle around her finger. At once she let it go and fall to her lap. I soon became pregnant. One would think I knew how to prevent such a thing, but that is how it happened. Despite my grief, the new life inside of me gave me a great deal of hope. Not everything in the world had given up its last breath, like my mother. And when I told Frederick about our baby on that early winter morning, he seemed overjoyed. He said we would get married the next week, before anyone else could see that I was with child. You may be young, Eliza, but you know enough to see that the sun does not shine so brightly on a child born out of wedlock. Concern bubbled inside me. Nella never mentioned a child, grown or otherwise. Where was the child now? Well, as you might suspect, I was not with child for much longer. It happens often, little Eliza, but that does not make it any less terrible. I hope that you never have to experience it. She pulled up her legs closer to her body and crossed her arms, as though protecting herself from what she was about to say next. It happened very late at night. Frederick meant to leave the city next week to visit family, so we'd spent the entire evening together. He fixed us supper, helped with the repairs of several shelves, read me a poem he had written, a perfect evening, or so I thought. He left me with a long kiss, promising to return the next week. Nella shuddered, and was silent a moment. Hours later the cramping began, and I lost my child. No words can describe the pain. Afterwards, I needed nothing so much as the comfort of Frederick's embrace. In bedridden agony, I waited for the weeks to pass, repressing my grief until he returned and could help me with the burden of it. But he did not show, not after the second week, nor the third. I began to suspect something terrible, and I thought it very strange that the night I fell ill, the night I lost our girl, was the last night he'd shown his face. Frederick was familiar with all the shelves and drawers in my shop, and as I said, even the more benign remedies may be deadly in great quantities. I checked several bottles again on my register, and to my horror, I saw that the motherwort was not at its recorded level. Frederick knew of its properties, since I had dispensed it to his sister Rissa. I realized then that he had used my own tinctures against me, against our child. We had spent so much time together, and it was not out of the realm of possibility that he had somehow disguised it and tricked me into ingesting it during our supper. I felt sure, as the days passed, that the motherwort meant to remove melancholy and bring joy to a new mother's soul had taken the child right from my womb. The back of my throat burned and tingled as Nella spoke. I wanted to ask how Frederick managed to deceive her, how he could have rooted through her things, slipped a single drop into her food and drink without her noticing, but I did not want to turn this against her, to make her feel any worse about it than she already does. Little Eliza, at last there was a knock at my door, and who do you think it was that had come to see me? Frederick, I said, leaning forward. No, his sister Rissa, except she was not his sister. She told me, without hesitation, that she was his wife. I shook my head as though this memory of Nella's was happening right now, in front of my eyes. How did she know where to find you? I stammered. She knew of my mother's shop for women's maladies. Remember, she was the one who first sent Frederick to me, when she badly needed the motherwort. She also knew he had a tendency, you might say, to skirt around. She asked me to share the truth with her. This was merely 4 weeks after I had lost the baby. I was still bleeding, still in great deal of heartache, and so I revealed everything to her. After she told me that I was not his first mistress, and then she began to ask questions about the bottles and brews on my shelf. I told her what I have told you, that in large quantities nearly everything is deadly, and to my great surprise, Rissa asked me for nux vomica, which can be used in very small doses to treat fever, even plague, but it is of course rat poison, the same thing that killed your master. Nella spread her hands wide. Upon her asking, I hesitated but a moment, but then dispensed her the deadly quantities, free of charge, and advised her how to best disguise the flavor, just as Frederick slipped a poison to me. I instructed Rissa how to do the same. That, child, is how it began, with Rissa, with Frederick. After Rissa left, there was a sense of release within me. Vengeance is his own medicine. She let out a small cough. Frederick was dead the next day. I read it that week, in the papers. Doctors blamed it on heart failure. Nella's coughing grew louder and rose into a full fit. She clutched her stomach, her breathing hoarse, for several minutes. At last she leaned forward, gasping, "My mother, my child, my lover," and so it went, like a tiny leak, slow and hushed at first. Word began to spread through the city. I did not know who Rissa told first, or who that person told next, but the web of whispers began to spread. At some point they started leaving letters, and I forced to build a wall in my shop to remain unseen. I had not the heart to close up the place of my mother's legacy, no matter how I had spoiled it. She patted the hay beside her. I know what it is to watch the child fall from my body at the hands of a man, and while my story is terrible, every woman has faced a man's wickedness to some degree, even you. She placed a hand on the floor, steadying herself as she began to tilt to one side. I am an apothecary, and it is my duty to dispense remedies to women, and so over the years they have come to me, and I have sold them what they wish. I have protected their secrets. I have borne and brunt their burdens. Perhaps if I had bled again after the loss, if my wound were not scarred, I would have stopped long ago. But the absence of bleeding has been a constant reminder of Frederick's betrayal and what he took from me. In the darkness, my brow furrowed into confusion. The absence of bleeding? I presumed she misspoke on account of her fatigue. Slowly, Nella fell onto her side, yawning and weak. I knew that her story was nearly over, but although she appeared exhausted, I was wide awake. "I cannot go on forever, of course," she whispered. "I am failing, and whereas I thought long ago that issuing such pain may ease my own, I was wrong. It has only grown worse, and my bones swell and ache with the passing of each week. I am sure that dispensing these poisons is destroying me from the inside, but how can I tear down what I have built? You heard Lady Clarence. My distinction is well known." She cleared her throat, licked her lips. "It is a strange puzzle," she concluded. "For as long as I've worked to fix women's maladies, I cannot fix my own. My grief has never gone away, not in 20 years. Speaking so quietly that I could hardly hear her, I wonder if she had not slipped into some peaceful nightmare. For this kind of pain, no such tincture exists. Will Ella and Eliza be able to finish the poison before Lady Clarence returns? We'll find out in Part 4 of The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner.